وصحبه أجمعين. I assume that most people know where we left off, and we will begin from the same point today, which is, of course, the ayah, الرجال قوامون على النساء. So, inshallah, we will continue from there. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as you know, in this ayah, makes this statement, which is very emphatic. الرجال قوامون على النساء. Men are literally the maintainers of women. And as we said last time, based on that also, the idea of to maintain, to be al-qawam, also indicates a certain amount of authority. That is to say that he is the head of the household, as we call it. Now, so to understand, and again in detail, what exactly that means and implies in terms of rights and responsibilities of both parties. And of course, obviously, we did touch on it maybe slightly, and we might do so again this time around, the kind of implications it makes for people in now what is the postmodern era, where we are far beyond the idea of equality between the sexes. We are now in the era of the idea that gender roles and gender are social fabrications which have no reality. And that implies a lot. In fact, they're using the word gender has its own implication, because basically people who are saying this are saying that sex is the biological difference between men and women, and gender is, again, a social construct which is invented in any given context by any different society or civilization or culture, so forth and so on. When they invent, quote unquote, certain roles and expectations based on a person's biological sex, this is what they call gender. So I hope everyone understands that, because that's the new definition now. New definition is that sex refers to the biological difference between men and women, and gender is a role that is given to those biological differences. And what they're saying in essence is that role is not just entirely subjective, it is entirely an invention of the given culture, society, civilization, etc., where people have a certain idea of what a gender should, or what a certain sex should do. That is what they call gender. So now that's why people say there's like 5 genders, or who knows what now, you know, maybe 6, 7, 8. Allah only knows if there's an end to this, right? Because what they're saying is that the role that you play, that is what gender is. And what they're also saying is that is entirely fabricated. It has no real reality. So that's why they're trying to, in essence, get rid of this whole idea of gender, and that people, because of their biological differences, have to play a certain role. And I have to say from the outset that although this ayah is more in context with the rights and obligations between spouses and what they have as a responsibility in that relationship, what they have to do, in other words, what in their responsibilities in that relationship, there is some obviously implication here, and in other hadith and in other situations, the Prophet ﷺ actually spelled out to us clearly that there is no doubt in Islam, we actually affirm gender roles. Okay, so it's almost the exact opposite of what we're being taught now, that gender is a fabrication, right? It has no real reality. Actually, we're taught the opposite, that gender is very important, actually, and that biologically you have differences, and even we should be different in the way that we behave, to such an extent that even the way we dress should be indicative of that biological sex that you happen to be, whether male or female. That's how far it is taken in the Deen of Islam, that even in our dress, even in our gait, okay, the way we walk, the way that we behave, there were very defined gender roles that we do not say have anything to do with the culture of the Arab of that time, because these are things that specifically Rasulullah actually pointed out, right? Men behaving in certain ways is not appreciable. Okay, women behaving in certain ways, in other words, trying to behave in a way that is considered to be masculine, is not appreciable with Allah. Nothing to do with the context or culture. So actually, we do have an emphasis also, not just on the biological differences, but we do have a concept of gender roles, that to the extent, and we might touch on this in this ayah when we explain the tafsir of this ayah, to the extent that even if there are exceptions, okay, so because part of the tafsir of this ayah is that why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give men this responsibility of maintaining women? And because of that, he's the head of the household. So part of this maintenance, as we already know, is nafaqah, that he has to pay, or he has to, excuse me, he has the financial responsibility to maintain the household and to give the woman her needs, right? That's his financial responsibility. Now, in that, some of the explanation is because, and again, here I may say things that for some of us, because for numerous reasons, may or may not find offensive. So that's a disclaimer from the beginning. But I asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy for all of us to be objective and to understand that at times the truth is not there to conform to what you feel should be right or wrong. Even the Prophet, it's very interesting that in regards to this ayah, there are many hadith where the Prophet ﷺ himself said that I wanted one thing and Allah wanted another, meaning that was for the Prophet himself ﷺ. He was ready to accept that whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed may not be in total conformance to how he felt or what he wanted. And as a Prophet of Allah, that's why he's Al-Amin. He is trustworthy because he doesn't mind accepting things that may go against what he naturally felt or what he wanted. All right. And we should have that discipline too. I think sometimes the hardest thing to do as one who is Muslim, who submits to the truth, is to overcome these personal feelings that we have about right and wrong and so forth and so on. It's harder than even fasting in Ramadan. See, physical exertion when we worship Allah can at times be even easy, right? It may be some struggle, but human beings, mashallah, we have the wherewithal to do incredible things. But when you ask a person to literally sacrifice their own personal inclinations, right? To sacrifice their own personal ideals of what they feel is right and wrong, there's probably nothing more difficult, right? So there's a lot more difficulty sometimes in accepting what is true, even if it is against your own interests, desires, and wishes. That's why when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us to be just, even if it's against yourselves, this is one ayah which many people, even non-Muslims, have said that this is the most profound, because this is the hardest thing to do. The hardest thing to do is to be just even at your own expense, right? In other words, again, that to accept the truth and what is right, even if it happens to be something that is hurtful to you, or is something that is against what you personally feel is right and wrong. So that's a disclaimer before we even start this discussion. Why? Because some of the exegetes like Qadi ibn al-Arabi, rahimahullah ta'ala, in his famous Ahkam al-Quran, explains the different reasons why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given this position to men. And one of them, frankly speaking, is because generally speaking, just from a very physical point of view, men, and it holds true today too, generally speaking, listen close to what I'm saying, are physically stronger than women. Okay. So obviously in any society, they should be given, because Allah Ta'ala gave them that physical strength, they should be given the responsibility of the burden of earning. All right. Because obviously in those days too, we're talking about in the time, and still today for many working class people, like I'm not trying to be offensive to anyone again, but I doubtless that many women here would volunteer to become, you know, a roofer or work in construction or anything like, right? Like, of course, nowadays, given that, you know, gender, like I said, in this definition and the way people are challenging that, who knows what's next, right? But normally speaking, again, this is the normal average woman doesn't have the wherewithal to do that, right? So men are expected, because they have been given that physical advantage, to earn. Okay, it's very simple. Are there women who are stronger than men? Of course. And this is also alluded to, I'll get to that too. Some of the exegetes and the mufassirun have mentioned that, but they are not the norm, they are exceptions. And we have to remember something, especially in Sharia, exceptions don't make the rule. As the saying is actually a principle, an-nadiru kal-ma'dum. Something that is the exception in terms of law is almost like it's non-existent. In other words, you can't make universal principles and laws, especially in Sharia, based on exceptions. Exceptions are exceptions. They can be treated like that too in certain cases. There's an exception here, but that is not the general rule. And the general rule is what we stay with or we stick by. We don't stick by exceptions. Yes, there are women who are definitely exceptional in every way. You know, it's interesting because my own daughter, I named her after Safiya, radiallahu ta'ala anha, not the wife of the Prophet, but his aunt. And because she was a very strong woman, right? Safiya, radiallahu ta'ala anha, the sister of Hamza, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, was a very strong woman. And anyone who has ever heard her stories and her life story in general, she was stronger than most men, period, in that time, let alone now, right? She was a very strong woman, but that's an exception, right? We don't make rules based on an exception, okay? She was an exceptional person, whether man or woman to begin with, but especially for women, she did things that even at that time, other women were very surprised, right? That she had that kind of strength and she had that kind of courage that was not normal amongst them, right? Like, this is a very strong woman. Again, reiterate that point. But bottom line of that is that's an exception. So the idea that men are given this role in society is because the general rule is they are more well equipped to do it. And that's an interesting thing, because even we talk about things like oppression, right? Injustice. And the word dhulm itself in Arabic is literally wad'u shay fi ghayri mawdi'i. It is to put something where it doesn't belong. To put something where it doesn't belong. You can even say from that, to give someone a responsibility that they are not able to do. So for instance, if you give the child the responsibility of lifting up a heavy object that is beyond their physical capacity, then this would be called dhulm. You're asking a child to do something which physically they are not able to do, okay? Does that mean women can't earn? No, nobody's saying that. Does that women can't have their own money? No, nobody's saying that. But generally speaking, today, the same rule still applies. Even to the extent that rarely, the exception excluded, most women, even if they exercise and work out, will not be equivalent to a man who does the same thing. They both lift weights, the body mass of both, it's not going to be the same, just physically speaking. So it's unfair in that respect. And no society, no matter what they feel about gender roles, can change that fact. So asking one to do a task wherewith Allah did not equip them to do that is in itself a type of oppression. This is the responsibility of the members of society who have been given the strength and the wherewithal to do it. Okay, instead of looking at as being unfair, look at that actually as hikmah. Hikmah literally means to put everything in its proper place, to know where things fit. And in any society, like we said before, when Allah Ta'ala said He created things in pairs, every society has to have an equilibrium and a balance of opposites, because opposites attract, as is the law, and also opposites work together, okay, because they both complement each other with attributes and qualities that one does not have. In other words, they both need each other so that they can use the qualities that they have at the exclusion of the other to work together and make a perfect union and equilibrium. That's the idea here. So men have that responsibility because, frankly speaking, the average man is going to be stronger. The average man has the wherewithal to do that, right? Even physically, we know that men can, you know, up and until their 60s, they can still procreate, so to speak. I'm sorry to be frank, but that's the truth. Women don't have that capacity, right? So there's things that biologically, physically, whether we like it or not, we're different. Instead of being upset about that, we should acquiesce and say, Qadarullah wa ma sha'a fa'al. This is the qadr of Allah. Whatever He wills, He had done. Okay? So if there is a difference here, there's a reason. And there is an idea that those differences are not just biological alone, that they are given because there is a gender role to be fulfilled. So when I'm saying all that, I'm also saying that the exceptions even are expected to play that role. So even if a man is not as physically built or as strong as most normal men should be, right? Perhaps a little physically weaker, he's still expected to try to fulfill the role of a man. Just like Safiya, radiallahu ta'ala anha, the aunt of the Prophet ﷺ, was an extremely strong and brave, courageous woman, but still she would play the role, if you will, of a mother, of a wife, right? The gender role, okay? So there are exceptions, but even then the exceptions, the Prophet ﷺ made it very clear that in dress, for instance, there should be a clear distinction amongst Muslims between the dress of a woman and the dress of a man, right? Clear distinctions. To the point that even Rasulullah cursed, la'an Allah. He said that the curse of Allah, the la'na of Allah, be on people, women who imitate men and men who imitate women. And this is all around, from dressing, speaking, even your gait, even the way you walk. Okay, so even in the way you walk, right, you should be, for instance, if you're a man, you should walk like how Rasulullah was described when he would walk with vigor, right, with intent, meaning he would walk not slowly and, you know, trying to kind of like be like a peacock, but rather walk with vigor and intent as if you are going to some place or to some important event. And that's literally how the Prophet ﷺ walking was described, that he would walk with vigor and in such a way that he would walk with intent. That is expected of us, right? As men, that we should, when we walk with a gait that shows that you are masculine, right? That you have testosterone, that there is intent behind your movements, right? And the same goes for women, right? Women should not do that unless there's a time and place when being a little, if you will, masculine is, again, this is all, we're not saying that there aren't times and places where a woman should be a little strong. Hind, radiallahu ta'ala anha, the wife of Abu Sufyan, it is famously known in a battle against the Romans when the men were retreating, she led the women outside of the tent and actually repelled the oncoming Romans with her and the women with her. Obviously, at that point of time, she wasn't being feminine, right? She was literally using tent pegs to repel an army. So she's actually not going to be too soft and feminine in her ways at that point in time, right? And that's a different context. But normally, when we're talking about society and how we interact as families and as people, there is expected in Islam that we have kind of gender roles, so to speak, right? And to that point, that we wouldn't accept, technically speaking, when raising children, that even if you see those tendencies in a boy or a girl, that the boy is a little bit more feminine or the girl seems to be a little bit more masculine, frankly speaking, and maybe this is another topic for another time, we wouldn't accept that to be grow into a habit where she's used to wearing men's clothes, boys' clothes, and being more, you know, masculine, and vice versa for the boy as well. We would try to teach them to play that gender role, which is, again, the exact opposite of what we're taught today. The exact opposite, right? That gender is just a fabrication that has no reality. So therefore, we have no right to force it on anyone, to even say what I've just said, that if you're physically a boy, then there's a way to behave that is manly. If you're physically a woman, then there's a way to behave that is feminine. So I probably we have to talk about this another time in a whole another. So let's get to the ayah and some of the aspects too that we originally I talked about, which were the rights and the responsibilities in this context, right? So it's interesting that Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhuma, in a narration of At-Tabari in his famous tafsir, he mentioned that the ayah al-rijalu qawwamuna 'ala an-nisa, that men are the maintainers, and I'm translating that because qawwam, which is the singular of qawwamuna, another form of it is qayyim. Qayyim literally means someone who maintains or someone who is the caretaker of something. Very famous scholar Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, right? Because his father was the qayyim, he's the one who took care of and maintained a school, an Islamic college, if you will, of Islamic theology and knowledge. He used to take care of it. He was the caretaker of it. So he was called qayyim. So the idea of qayyim or qawwam here is to maintain or take care of somebody or something. Okay, so that's why I'm translating it as the maintainers of women. So in this regard, he said that they have a position of authority here, umarahu alayha, and if she accepts that authority, in tuti'ahu fima amaraha Allahu bihi min ta'atihi. So he is the one who will be in charge of the family, in so much as she will accept that authority in regards to all the things that Allah has commanded her to accept as his authority. Let me say that one more time, that he is in a position of authority, so she would have to obey or listen in terms of those things which Allah has given him authority. And then he explained, actually, what are those things? وَطَاعَتُهُ أَن تَكُونَ مُحْسِنَةً إِلَى أَهْلِهِ. So what would be that those things that she is expected to be obedient, in other words, or to listen to him and follow his leadership? The first thing that he mentions, that what does this mean? His obedience, so to speak. And remember, ta'ah, the word in Arabic, also means willful obedience. Willful obedience. So that means, and we're going to get to that also in other exegetes of the Quran, they mention this, that when the man is worthy of trust, when he's ameen, because obviously the presumption is before you get married, you should have already done your homework, right? So you should have already known that this man was worthy of being a leader. So as long as you can trust him and he can lead you, then willfully you should follow. This is ta'ah, willfully, right? Not being forced, but willfully you should follow. I mean, after all, you're the one who chose him, right? So we're hoping that you have chosen to be with someone who you can, of your own volition, and feel comfortable willfully to say, okay, I'm going to follow him, right? I'm going to trust him and follow him. But in regards to what? Number one, that she should be good to his family, right? That she should behave in a way, that's the first aspect, that if he wants the wife to be good to his family, to his ahl, which includes his children, obviously, and his extended family, then that's part of it. She should not be a person who mistreats his family or does anything to separate them. Now, I must say that even in that regard, certain Muslim cultures, and I've run into this personal experience in tajriba, not having knowledge of Sharia, don't really understand what that means. For instance, and this is not just in the Indian subcontinent. Now, I'm being very frank. I met other Muslim cultures, and I won't give names. I don't want to pick out groups, but where they've come for counseling. And part of the issue was that the husband expected his wife to live with his parents, right? In other words, he brought his parents into his home and he expected his wife to live with them. Not just to live with them, we know in many cultures, because of a misunderstanding of this, probably, maybe, we don't know really how this came about, that being good to the family meant that, okay, now she has to serve them too. So not only does she have to get up every morning and smile and, make sure that her mother-in-law, which is usually, you know how that is, the mother-in-law, smiles at them and makes them happy and serves them. And of course, no woman is ever going to be good enough for her beta, so that's going to be problematic. But that's what they think is being good. Little do they know that in the Sharia, if you actually looked up a book of fiqh and you studied the rights of husband and wife, you'd be surprised. And people were very surprised when I told them this. The wife has a right to completely separate housing, and she does not, or she cannot be forced to live with her in-laws. Lo and behold. So being good, in this case, obedience to the husband means to be good to his family, does not include that. It is not your right to force her to serve your parents. It is not your right to force her to live with your parents. To such an extent, literally in Sharia, she can demand separate housing. She can literally go to a mufti or qadi if it was, an Islamic, if you will, right? A place where Sharia actually was in vogue. She can literally go and say, okay, I don't want to live with my in-laws. I don't want to serve my in-laws, right? She has that right. So being good to them does not mean those things. It does not imply that. So that has to be very clear. Being good to them means more than anything to not be hurtful by arguing or by doing anything in their behavior that would display some type of, would hurt the feelings of the in-laws. But she does not have to live with them. They do not have to be in the same roof or house, and she is not required to serve them as well. If she does serve them, right, if she does on her own will, if she says, not as a right of the husband, but I am willing to allow my in-laws to live with us, I am willing to serve your mother, right? Then that is from the goodness of her own heart. Okay, it has nothing to do with the right that is explained here. So you have to be kind of clear. These things are very important because this happened a lot. In fact, some of the cases that I mentioned, this was the explicit complaint of the wife, why they were having troubles in their marriage, because he brought his parents in and he expects me to serve them and just live with them without any problems. And I said, actually, that's his fault because that's not his right. And you have the right to actually separate housing. Okay. So there's a lot of misconceptions here about what it means to be good to his family. That's not included in it. That is not amongst the rights of the husband over the wife. That has to be very clear. So that's number one. So in other words, Ibn Abbas in this narration is saying that the first thing he mentioned, what are these rights that Allah gave to the husband and which he is expected to follow, to obey? Number one, being good towards his family. And number two, that she should be hafidatan limalihi, that she should protect his wealth. Quite a simple thing, right? Protect his wealth. In other words, his money, his wealth, she should not spend it freely without permission or in things that he would be offended if she used it in that way, right? Easy. Protect his wealth. Don't run off with his money, right? And spend it any way you want. The important part of that too is that some ulama say that yes, there are certain things, like for instance, the mahar, once the man gives it, as we've already seen in Surah An Nisa, then actually that money is hers, right? It's no longer his. But even though the man is obliged to spend in a marriage, nafaqah, he still has his own wealth. And even if, as some ulama pointed out here, that in the same house, it's his money, but obviously it's going to be shared, right? But that does not mean that technically it's still not his wealth, frankly speaking, right? If he's doing his job and paying for rent, for instance, the house, right, and it's all coming from his expenditure, then technically that is still his wealth. No doubt when he passes, or if he passes, she has a right to that now. But during his life, technically speaking, keep it in your mind, it is considered limalihi. It's his wealth. Okay, it's not yours. So you can't spend it any way you want. Right? You have to have some regard to his wishes and what he wants when regards to his wealth, because it's technically still his. And even that would be definitely according to the spirit of fairness. Everyone wants to be fair and equal. Well, if this man is earning money, technically speaking, it's his, right? So wife or not, who is anyone else to come and take somebody else's money and say, I'm going to do what I want with it? Right? That's not fair, right? So you have to keep that in mind. Yes, you are his wife, so definitely you will be sharing it, right? That wealth that he earns. But that doesn't take the aspect out of it that it is still, again, idafa, his money. So don't spend it in a way or use it in a way that would upset him. Okay, that is where they are expected to be obedient. Does that make sense? And of course, the third aspect, which is what this ayah is actually about, is in the deen of Allah. That is to say that the man has two aspects of maintenance. الرجال قوامون على النساء. One is in regards, of course, what we just mentioned, right? The interaction between husband and wife in terms of a very dry monetary issue, right? He has the responsibility of maintaining, in other words, spending of his wealth to make sure that she has everything that she needs, to provide a home, so forth and so on. Now, because of that, she also has to be reverent and obedient in terms of his money, to not use it in ways and take it in ways that it would displease him, right? Unless, of course, and again, all these things kind of have to be explained in detail, unless, of course, he's stingy. Using Hind, radiallahu ta'ala anha, again as an example, her husband Abu Sufyan is a very famous hadith. She complained that Abu Sufyan is very wealthy, but he doesn't give me anything. I'm just telling you, he has a lot of money, but he's very stingy and he doesn't want to give me anything. So in this case, the Prophet ﷺ gave her permission to take his money. So obviously there are exceptions here. That is to say that if he refuses, while having the money, to give money to his wife, then there is permission for the wife to take money from him, even if he doesn't like it. All right. So there is, so if the husband has money, he doesn't want to spend it. And that also includes, by the way, there's a lot of explanation to this, that if you have a good income, if you're a wealthy person, frankly speaking, then, and the woman too is used to that type of lifestyle, then expenditure means more than just, for instance, a house and food and clothing. It also includes all the other things that she's used to. Okay, that now has to be the responsibility if you have the money, right? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, let those who have wealth, let those who are wealthy spend from their wealth. If you have it, then you have to spend accordingly, right? Then, right, you can't use this excuse that I don't want my wife to spend my money on these things. Well, you have the money for it. She's used to it. That's part of the nafaqah now. Those who have the money should spend. Those who have the money should give. So in that case, you have to understand, it's not the same thing, right? If a person has limited income, then he is not responsible for those kind of things, right? So it's all, if you look at it, right, there's a very reasonable type of expectation here. The idea is this, that again, as the woman, he provides, it's his money, you be conscious that to not spend that money in places that you know he would be upset. Okay, Places that you know it is not fair, that I'm going to just take this money and spend it on frivolous things. But if you have money and you have the means and you want to buy nice things, then that is fine. That is part of the responsibility of the husband as well. لِيُنْفِقْ ذُو سَعَةٍ مِنْ سَعَتِهِ. So if you have the money, again, you spend it. Okay, I hope I'm making myself clear in these things. So again, here Ibn Abbas says that the obedience that is meant here is to be good towards his family and to protect his wealth. That is to say, to not give it or spend it in places or for things that are not within your rights, because that's not included, or in places outside of that in things that he would be upset, right? So if it's within your rights, that's fine. Reiterate, I just made it clear, for a wealthy people and a woman who's used to that lifestyle, having extra things outside of just basic clothing like jewelry and, obviously not too extravagant. I mean, you have to have a limit to a certain, right? But those things are included in this, right? She also should be provided for in that respect if you have the money. Okay, let's just leave it at that, because of course a lot of questions will probably come out of that, because it's a very general, it's not, we're not being too specific, right? And how can we, right? You don't want to quantify everything to like how much money can you spend on whatever, this, that, and the other thing. You have to have a little bit of room here, because no relationship can work like that. Everyone should have an idea of when you're just living according to what you're used to, that means that you're used to having, and when you're being extravagant, right? At least you should have an idea of that. This is budgeting and knowing what you have. There is a hadith Imam al-Bayhaqi has related that the Prophet ﷺ said, al-iqtisadu fi al-nafaqa nisf al-ma'isha, that to be balanced when you spend, literally fi al-nafaqa, is half of your livelihood. So here we're given a principle by the Prophet ﷺ that you need to know a little bit of how to deal with your financial situation and spend accordingly. If you know how to use your money wisely and you know how to spend in a way that you're doing it in a balanced and concerted way, then that is half of your livelihood. According to the Prophet ﷺ, to be wise when it comes to your budget and what you spend on is half of your livelihood. Again, this is a very general principle because everyone's different. Everyone has a different income, everyone has a different budget, but every family should know that. Husband and wife, right? Now, I know that in some cultures, another thing I discovered too, that some cultures, like, this idea of gender roles is such that some women don't even know how much money their husband is making. I've heard that before, right? They don't even know. So I'm not going to tell you do this, do that, but at least in the house, there should be some idea of a budget and what you have to spend, right? And what would be reasonable, okay? You understand? There should be some idea, because this is half of your livelihood. Nothing wrong with that. So, okay, we go on. The second part, of course, is beyond money and monetary affairs. The second part is in regards to the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is where, again, we said, as the hadith says, "Kulukum ra'in wa kulukum mas'ulan an ra'iyatihi," that everyone is a shepherd and everyone is responsible for their flock. So this also in regard to the deen of Allah. So if the wife, this is what this ayah is actually related to. If the wife is slacking in her duties towards Allah, it is also the responsibility of the husband to remind her as a person in this leadership position. In the same way as we mentioned last time, that as a wife, as a mother, if the children are slacking, she also has in that position, as in this case, she over her children is in a position of leadership, then she must also exert her authority over them by disciplining them, right? And teaching them. So that's how it works, okay? In terms of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is not just monetary affairs. This also has to do in terms of our deen, that each person has a leadership position each person is responsible for how they exert it and or how they use it. All right. So just as you are responsible for, as in this case, a man for expenditure and maintaining the household physically, you also should take the responsibility seriously of maintaining the household in terms of deen. And just as the woman should take responsibility here in obedience by not using his wealth in ways that are inappropriate or ways that would hurt him or the family, she also should be responsible in terms of the deen of Allah in the same way as well. Okay, that is the leadership position that everyone is given, and nobody can really run away from if they have a family. That's how the family unit is maintained. So again, just to understand all of this, to cap it all up, inshallah, or wrap it up, excuse me, that الرجال قوامون على النساء, they are the maintainers. Right? Qawam, qayyim means the same thing. That he is entrusted, as Imam Ibn al-Arabi says, Qadi Ibn al-Arabi, not so people don't get confused, rahimahullah ta'ala, huwa aminun alayha yatawalla amraha, that he is entrusted to take care of her. Okay, he is entrusted, amin, yani he is entrusted to take care of her and her affairs. And because of that, now he is responsible to make sure that her affairs are maintained properly. That if that's why we mentioned again, even these positions, social positions of wealth are taken into consideration. If that's what she's used to, then you should try and maintain it. All right. Now, this doesn't mean, again, like putting this again in perspective, that doesn't mean that there can be exceptions. If, for instance, a woman from a wealthy background decides to marry, and her, this is another issue that probably a lot of us need to study, the position of also the wali and in the marriage and the actual the couple itself, whether people are really compatible. But if for whatever reason it happens, a woman who has a status above the man in wealth, it's not haram. Okay, just because we consider it to be something important in a marriage doesn't mean that if the family agrees and she agrees to live like that, then that's fine. But then she willingly has to acquiesce that, okay, I'm marrying a man who cannot provide the life that I'm used to, and I'm okay with that. But if she knows that she's not okay with that, then she shouldn't do it, because the man is responsible now for maintaining that. Right? And that's usually why we say compatibility is important, because without it, the relationship is usually not going to be that good. But that does not mean that if the woman agrees to it and the family is okay with her decision, right, that she can marry someone who does not provide the same type of life that she's used to. As long as she knows that that's not going to be an issue and she can live with that, there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's not the case, compatibility demands, because this is the responsibility of the maintainer of women, الرجال قوامون على النساء, that they also provide what she's used to, what she would be happy and comfortable with. If she decides that I can be happy and comfortable without those things, that's a different issue. So let's stop there. I know there's probably a lot more questions, inshallah, but we'll stop there. And if there is any questions, inshallah, bismillah.
Okay, great. Jazakumullah, Brother Dickinson. Any questions, please unmute yourself and speak up.
So Imam, obviously after the deen, the ayat implies that a woman's, primary responsibility is the family. What if there, nowadays, if a family is in a financial situation where, that's not such a, that luxury can't be had?
Yes. So, okay, yeah, good question. And I should have brought it up. I maybe alluded to it somewhat in saying that, a woman can, of her own will, and if the family agrees, can obviously marry a man who is not, doesn't have the same social status in terms of wealth, right? That's fine. But there is also the case, this is actually in Sahih
Is that,
Bukhari.
before you move, is that, you seem to imply that is that frowned upon?
Well, in some, that's the thing. There's a lot of issues here. So there's the idea of kafa'a, which means compatibility in marriage. Normally, it is something that is not encouraged. Let's put it that way. I don't want to put it frowned upon, but it's not encouraged, only because of two reasons. Number one, if the family objects to it, there's a problem. And also if the woman herself, because if she demands, for instance, that, or if she expects that type of lifestyle, now here the man is the qayyim, the qawam, he's kind of expected to provide it if he can, and it's only reasonable if he can. But what if he can't? And she has an issue with that. Perfect example of this is, you know, the story of excuse me. Anyhow, I'll get back to you about that. But you understand my point? It can cause a problem in the relationship, and if it can cause a problem in the relationship, then it's better not to. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
But if the woman doesn't mind that, then that's not an issue. You get what I'm saying?
Right.
If she can live with it, then that's because it boils down to that. Will she be able to live that lifestyle and be happy? If she can and the family doesn't mind, that's fine. After all, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he married Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha, he didn't have much wealth at that time, and she did.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
So you have to put things into consideration. So to answer your question, there's a narration in Sahih Bukhari where the wife of a famous companion, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala anhu, came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to ask specifically that, you know, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu is a poor man. I happen to have enough wealth that I need to pay zakat. Can I give my zakat to him? And he actually said that your husband is more deserving of it than somebody else. You see my point? That it's better for you to give zakah to your husband than anyone else. It's the same. If you remember in the beginning of this surah, we talked about if the woman gives some of her mahar back to the husband out of bitib and nafs, meaning from her own volition and free will, without any ill feelings, she decides to give some of it to him. Not only is it a good thing, but it is said there's barakah in it. See what I'm saying? Not only is it good, but there's barakah in it. So this is something I find too, you know, you have to balance it. Just because men are given this responsibility, sometimes we see many Muslims going to the other extreme, thinking that, I've seen women say this, you know, like, well, the Sharia says that if I earn money, it's mine and I don't have to give anything to my husband. That's fine. But let me remind you that we're talking about many things that are just like rights and rules of the Sharia. Remember, when it comes to your own personal rights, the rights of Allah, you cannot change. All right. If there's something that is specific in Sharia, that this is the right of Allah over his slave, you cannot change that. When it comes between the rights of human beings, believe it or not, you can relinquish a right. Do you get my saying? That you have over somebody else. So just because the Sharia says the man should spend and your money is your money, doesn't mean that it's not a good idea to give some of your money to him. You understand what I'm saying? Because if that was the case, why would the Prophet ﷺ tell Zainab, was the name of the wife of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, that not only can you give zakat to him, but it'd be better that you give it to him than to anyone else. Why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say there's barakah if a woman on her free will gives even a portion of her own mahar, which is again her wealth, to her husband? Am I making sense here?
Yeah.
So yes, obviously, when a family gets in a situation like that, after all, Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha started the enterprise of the Prophet ﷺ with her own wealth, in which he earned more than she had, right? Brought her great profit. Okay, you see what I'm saying? So obviously, it should be obvious to us that yes, it is the responsibility of the man, and in the right of the woman too, that he takes care of that responsibility. But that does not negate that if she does have wealth, or she does earn money, yeah, she doesn't have to spend it on him, no doubt. That's true, but that doesn't mean she shouldn't. To put it bluntly, If you're trying to live in a marriage that's just based on whose right is who, you're never going to be happy. Okay, you have to go above and beyond the call of duty sometimes to keep everyone happy, right? It goes both ways for the husband and the wife. You can't just live a life where it's my right, it's my right, it's my right, right? Sometimes you have to relinquish your own rights at times, and sometimes you know that's the whole point. To keep the other person happy, you go above and beyond the call of duty. So there's nothing wrong with that. If there's a situation where for whatever reason, you know, unemployment, things happen, right? That she has money, she doesn't have to spend it, no doubt, but it's better, right? In the same way, I know this is going to offend a lot of people too. This is something that comes up a lot also. People find out from books of fiqh that it is not the right of the man that the woman cooks, right? Which is true. It's not her, it's not his right. But that doesn't mean that if you're playing this traditional Muslim role where you're staying at home, you're a stay-home mom, and he's going out and earning and paying for everything, he's paying for the food, he's paying for the rent, and then you don't cook. Yeah, it's not your right, but that's not really a good strategy there. You understand? It's not really a good thing to do. That if you're working too and you're busy, that's a different story. But I'm talking about, you know, you're a stay-home mom, you're not doing anything else, and he's going out all day and earning, and you have to think to yourself, even though it's not my right, is that fair? He's paying for all the bills, bringing the food home, and you refuse to cook because it's not your right. How would that look, right? So you can't live a life in a marriage that's just based on my right is this and my right is that. Okay, am I being clear?
Yeah.
Right? And when the time and place comes, the relationship should be such that if you are friends, not just husband and wife, then you're able to work together like that. We are together as a team, right? Yes, you're the husband, it's your responsibility. But I understand it's hard times, things happen, no problem, right? And actually, if you trust him enough, that should come easily. Am I right or am I wrong?
Right.
Khadija radiallahu anha obviously trusted Rasulullah with her wealth and her business. Said, here, take it and do what you can. And he did. He performed beyond expectation. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if, again, that comes down to, I guess, maybe choice at the time of marriage. But if you have that kind of relationship where you're not even willing to help, I mean, what kind of relationship is that? SubhanAllah, I would ask that question, right? You're in this situation, you're not even willing to help. And it's there, that would be something to consider amongst the couple. Like, what kind of relationship do we have if we can't do that? So when speaking about these things, you have to understand that rights, again, huquq al-ibad, are something that sometimes a person has to be willing to sacrifice what is their right, so to speak, to keep a relationship going, inshallah.
Thank you so much, brother. I think Ahmad had to leave.
Yeah, I saw that, mashallah.
Any other questions? Anybody has any other questions? Okay, great. I'll take silence as a no. So, inshallah, Imam, we will meet next Sunday, inshallah, same time, continue the same topic. I mean,
Yes,
further
inshallah.
along the Surah An Nisa, inshallah. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. I'm gonna end the meeting now. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.